The words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. A couple of years ago, Tannery and I and the kids spent a few days on this beautiful small island in the Gulf of Thailand. And early one morning, I wake up excited to go on a run on the beach in this exotic place. So I walk out onto the sand and I'm doing a few stretches as I'm staring out at this perfectly manicured view. It's like straight out of a magazine with the white sand and palm trees everywhere and colorful long-tailed fishing boats in the beautifully transparent blue water. And I'm thinking to myself, this couldn't possibly be more perfect. Me training on a beach, on an exotic island on the other side of the world. I mean, this is how I picture the ideal version of myself right here. And just to kind of give you a sense, as I turned to start running, what was going on for me was, and what I was going for, kind of in this kind of space, was something along the lines of the opening scene from The Bourne Supremacy. I don't know if you guys remember this, but where the unstoppable Jason Bourne, this elite international assassin, is training on a beach in Goa, India, to adrenaline pumping music in the background. So that's the ideal version of rugged, adventurous manhood that I was aiming for. In reality, what happened is that within the first 10 seconds of me running, this stupid stray dog decided to chase me aggressively, and it's nipping at my ankles as I'm starting to run. So instead of the Jason Bourne kind of image, it ended up being more like a scene from Dumb and Dumber. And if you just like fast forward a couple of minutes later, I'm stranded in a tree that I've managed to climb up in, and the dog is just waiting on me to come down. Not exactly how I imagined my morning going. So do you have an ideal version of yourself that you have a hard time living up to? Do you have an ideal version of yourself that you have a hard time living up to? Maybe that ideal self is a little more self-controlled, maybe eats healthier, exercises more, reads more, meditates or prays more, volunteers more, is more active on social justice issues. Maybe that ideal version of yourself practices more generosity or is a more attentive parent or spouse or friend, is less reactive, maybe a little more successful, a little more confident, a little more responsible. Do you have an ideal version of yourself? I'm trying to give all the examples so I'm not leaving anyone out here. An ideal version of yourself that you aim for and you aspire to, that perhaps is your personal standard for success, but you find that most of the time you tend to fall short of that standard. And maybe sometimes, like me, you wake up in the middle of the night thinking about how you're falling short of that standard because of a lack of time or energy or resources or a lack of drive or motivation or self-discipline. Or maybe you wrestle with the internal inconsistency between what you want and how you act. Like, how could I want something so badly to be my reality when I step back and I look at the big picture of my life and I say, here are some practices that I think would be really good for me and would make me feel a lot better about myself. So the inconsistency between that desire and then finding yourself in the moment, not caring as much as you do about when you're not in that moment and you're looking at the big picture. I was talking to someone the other day who's been struggling with an addiction for years, gets sober for a while and then falls back. And this person said to me, it's really disorienting for me to know what's the good that I need, like the good that's for me, to know what that is and to really want that. And at the same time, not doing the things that are ever going to get me there. It's really disorienting to want something and just to not do the things that get you there. Similarly, for most of us, I think there's a pretty big gap between the ideal version of ourselves and who we are most of the time. And maybe you've heard me say this before, but in an ideal world, there's three things that I'm going to do daily. It's carve out time to read, to exercise, and to floss. But for some reason, I can only seem to get 2 out of 3 any given day. And that's a good day, right? 2 out of 3 is a good day. So anyway, we tend to all fall short of the ideal self. And Paul is wrestling with this very issue in the letter to the Romans today, the passage we read. The gap between the ideal version of himself and reality. Listen again to how he articulates this. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. I can will what is right, but I can't do it. For I do not do the good that I want, but the evil I do not want is what I do. Right? It's just like the struggle is so clear. So what's this all about? First of all, let me give a little bit of background on Paul so that we can understand the context in which he is describing this very accessible, I think, struggle. So first of all, originally he wasn't Paul until he was past 30. His name was Saul. And Saul was a very religious, observant Jew. He was born in Tarsus, which is somewhere in central to southern Turkey today, around 2 AD. So if you're kind of doing the math, he's just about 4 years younger than Jesus. Most scholars believe Jesus was born in about 3 BC. So just about 4 or 5 years younger than Jesus. He grew up in a religious household, and then he was sent to Jerusalem. His family literally sent him away to Jerusalem between the ages of 10 and 13 to study Pharisaic rabbinical law. So he was at kind of the top of his class. And I don't know if they had an application system back then, but he goes to Jerusalem and he ends up studying under the most notable rabbi and biblical scholar of the time, whose name is Gamaliel. And if you kind of have heard me talk before about these two iconic rabbis, Hillel and Shammai, Gamaliel is the grandson of Hillel. So this guy is really well known. It's incredible, such an honor. And Paul exceeds all of his classmates and he becomes the top student. So this is how he describes himself. He says, he says this in Philippians, circumcised on the 8th day, a member of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin. These are all the check marks he's giving. A Hebrew, born of Hebrews. As to the law, I am a Pharisee. As to zeal, I was a persecutor of the church. Like it couldn't possibly be more zealous for the Jewish religion than to be out there persecuting these heathen Christians who were saying that they're a part of Judaism. And then he says, as to righteousness under the law, listen to this word, flawless. This is how he describes himself. And so what happens is this guy, Saul, who is a trained rabbinical scholar, this is his whole world. He's the top of his class. He's the most zealous of them. He appears for the first time in our scriptures, not during the life of Jesus. I mean, if you're kind of listening, he lived in Jerusalem all throughout the time of Jesus. So like when Jesus was doing his ministry, Paul was alive in Jerusalem, supposedly interacting with all the conspiracies and all the weird things about Jesus and Jews and all this kind of stuff. He was there in the middle of it, but we don't hear anything about him in the Gospels. First time we hear anything about him is in the book of Acts, when Stephen is being stoned, one of the Christian martyrs. We talked about him a few weeks ago. And Paul, we're told, is there, and he is approving of this, and this becomes for him the kind of generating moment where he goes out and he also starts persecuting churches all around the Roman world. So he is like the emissary on behalf of the Jews to go out and to persecute Christians and to bring them to justice. So in the middle of this process, this religious icon, Paul, has a profound experience where he encounters Jesus on the way to Damascus, and it just throws him off. So this guy that he knew, that he had seen, that he's persecuting all of his followers, now shows up to him in some spiritual vision, and he has a life-transforming experience. So here's where Paul is at this point. As kind of he wraps his mind around this big shift in his life, he has to work out and wrestle with, from a theological standpoint, remember, he's a trained rabbinical scholar. He has to wrestle with and work out, from a theological standpoint, how faith in Christ relates or fits in with Judaism. He's got to figure this out. He can't just toss out everything he knows. This is like super important for him. And specifically, how do you harmonize two seemingly opposite approaches? One that says righteousness is something that you earn through obedience to the law. That's Judaism. And another that says righteousness is a free gift from God. You can't earn it. It's a free gift through Jesus Christ. So here's Paul, and he's got to figure out how to reconcile these two seemingly opposing things. And in his letter to the Romans, we get the most comprehensive articulation of Paul's conclusion. So if you go back today and you just read the letter to the Romans from beginning to end, it'll take you probably an hour to do that. I did it yesterday, and I read it out loud, and I read it pretending like I'm in the Church of Rome and someone came reading it for the first time, you know? And so I was reading it. And just to give you a little kind of background, as you read it and you hear this thing, just know this. This is not a part of the sermon. This is just, it's helpful. That Paul is trying to remind Gentiles and Jews in the church in Rome that they're both on equal ground. So he humbles the Jews and he humbles the Gentiles. So just keep that in mind. So the gist of his theological conclusion is this. Here's the book of Romans in a nugget. The purpose of the law of the Moses, is not to make you righteous, but rather it's to make you conscious of your sin and to bring you face to face with your inability to attain righteousness on your own. Because this is what he says. He says that if you've spent any time at all trying to follow all of the commandments and precepts of the Hebrew scriptures, and you're honest about it, if you're really honest, then you know just how incapable you are of getting it all right all the time. You just can't do it. It's impossible. So by virtue of that experience, the law is meant to actually highlight your inability to meet the law and to attain righteousness on your own. So the purpose of the law is to make you aware of your shortcomings and that righteousness cannot be earned. And this, Paul says, is where the power of God's grace comes into the picture. That God, through Jesus, listen just how much of a relief this is if you've just practiced the law your whole life, that it covers us all. And righteousness is given as a free gift to all. Why? Because God loves us. And it's as simple as that. And it's in this context, well, I say it's as simple as that, but imagine if your whole life you've been works-oriented, right? Follow the law, you get righteousness. And imagine someone coming up to you and saying, you don't need any of that. And Paul has this whole really elaborate argument about why the law is really good. You can't toss it out. It's really important. So I think you'll enjoy it when you read the book of Romans. But it's in this context of exploring this that Paul talks about this struggle between the ideal version of himself, how he truly wants to honor God in every aspect of his life and live in a way that's always consistent with the utmost integrity, and the reality that he always seems to fall short of this ideal self. And you hear the frustration and the vulnerability in his words as he's describing this shortcoming, where I just read to you a few minutes ago. I don't understand my own actions, why I do the things I don't want to do, and the things I do want to do, I don't. And it's a sentiment that I think all of us can identify with when we think about trying to live up to the ideal versions of ourselves. But here's the thing. For Paul, there's an answer to this struggle. So this is where you start paying attention if you haven't been. The answer to this struggle is not for him what it used to be. What it used to be is when he falls short of the ideal self, it was shame and guilt and fear around falling short. And then he would get up the next day and he would try harder. Now he says, he sees his shortcomings as a gift because they lead him to a deeper appreciation of God's grace. Because, as he says, the less adequate I am, the more grace is at work in my life. And the less dependent I am on trying to earn love or earn acceptance from God or from just my idea of the ideal self, the more opportunities I have to reflect on the power of God's unconditional love. So for him, in his mind, if you're perfect, there's no room for God. And the more shortcomings you have, the greater your experience of God's grace in your life. So he turns it into a beautiful thing. I had a conversation with our Bishop Marianne buddy a few years ago. We were sitting around her dinner table, and this is one of the most meaningful conversations that I've had so many with her. And if you know Marianne, you know exactly why I often talk about her like she is just a hero and a mentor of mine. But it was really fascinating. We're sitting having this conversation, and I was kind of vulnerable, and I said, do you ever say things in public that you regret? And for me, I had developed this kind of practice where I get up on Sunday mornings, and I, rather than feel really terrible when I say something stupid, I just tell myself beforehand, today I'm going to say something stupid, so just watch out for it, And so then when I say something accidental in the service that in my own mind doesn't live up to the ideal self, I go, oh, there it is. It's kind of like I'm noticing it as opposed to it throwing me off. But this is often a thing, right? Like you're a public figure, you're often going to feel like you say things. So I asked her this question, and she said, all the time. And she said, what I do is I do my best and I move on. And that's how she said it. You do your best and you move on. It was her way of saying, you just move on. You don't dwell on it. You do your best, you move on. And that's kind of where I want to land the sermon today. In my conclusion, I just want to say, where does this leave us? Do you have an ideal version of yourself that you have a hard time living up to? The answer, of course, for every single one of us is yes. Why? Because we're human. And somewhere along the way, each of us internalized a set of standards, whether it's because of how we grew up or it was experiences that we've had in life, a set of standards that define what success looks like for us. And we also, I think most of us have a pretty good sense that we would feel healthier and we would feel like our lives were more intentional if we took time to build in healthier and more intentional practices. We all know this. But my message today is not the self-help, how do you do a better job living up to your ideal self? There's going to be another time for that. Once I figure it out, I'll let you know. But today, the message is not, how do you do a better job aligning your life more with the ideal version of yourself? No, today's message is a message of grace. And here it is. You're doing a good job. You're doing a good job. Life isn't easy. We're all doing our best to make our time here more meaningful. We're all going to fall short of the perfect, and that is good. Because that leaves some room for God's grace, which is more valuable to you and to me than a single day of perfect living. And so I just want to leave that with us today. Do your best and move on. Amen.